What happens when a man who has never known suffering, who has lived his entire life behind walls of silk and gold, suddenly sees the world as it truly is? This is not merely the story of a prince, it is the story of a consciousness being cracked open. It is the story of 4 encounters that would change the course of human history. Welcome to The Life of the Buddha. I am your guide through one of the most profound spiritual journeys ever recorded. This is episode 2, The 4 Sights. To understand the 4 sights, we must first understand what Siddhartha Gautama had been protected from, and why. Following the prophecy of the sage Asita, King Suddhodana of the Shakya clan made a decision that would define his son's childhood and young adulthood. The king resolved that no darkness would ever reach the prince. No suffering, no decay, no death. 3 palaces were constructed, one for each season of the Indian year. The summer palace offered cool marble floors and shaded courtyards. The monsoon palace stood elevated above the floods. The winter palace was warm with fires and tapestries. Each was surrounded by high walls, ornamental gardens, and carefully selected attendants. All young, all healthy, all beautiful. By royal decree, the aged were removed from Siddhartha's presence. The sick were kept out of sight. The dying were carried elsewhere. Even wilting flowers were replaced before the prince could see them fade. This was not cruelty. This was a father's love, expressed through control. Suddhodana had heard the prophecy. His son would become either a great king who would unify the world, or a great ascetic who would abandon it entirely. The king had chosen, firmly and without compromise, the former. The sage Asita, who had descended from his Himalayan hermitage to examine the newborn prince, had seen in the child's 32 major marks and 80 minor marks the signs of an extraordinary being. His words had been precise. If the prince remained in the world, he would become a Chakravartin, a wheel-turning monarch, a universal king. But if he were to encounter the suffering inherent in existence, he would renounce all worldly things and become a fully awakened one, a Sammasambuddha, a supreme Buddha. Asita had wept, not from sadness at the child's fate, but from the knowledge that he himself would not live long enough to hear the prince's teachings. Suddhodana had absorbed the prophecy and made his choice. His son would be surrounded by every earthly pleasure. Every desire would be fulfilled before it could be voiced. Every question about impermanence would be answered with distraction. For nearly 3 decades, the plan had worked. By the time Siddhartha had reached the age of 29, he was, by every external measure, a man who possessed everything. He had married Yasodhara, a princess of remarkable intelligence and beauty, in a contest of martial skill that the young prince had won decisively. They had a son, Rahula, whose very name, meaning fetter or chain, would later carry a weight of meaning that neither parent could have anticipated at his birth. Siddhartha was accomplished in the martial arts, in philosophy, in statecraft. He was beloved by his people. The succession of the Shakya kingdom was secure. And yet, there was a restlessness that no palace could contain, a longing that no feast could satisfy, an unease that returned in the quiet hours before dawn, when the laughter of the dancers had faded and the lamps burned low. He had everything. And still something remained unanswered. According to the Nidānakathā, one of the most detailed early accounts of the Buddha's life, it was during one of his rare excursions beyond the palace walls that the 4 encounters took place. Siddhartha requested permission from his father to travel through the city. The king, ever cautious, commanded his ministers to prepare the roads. Guards cleared the path. Garlands were hung. The infirm, the elderly, the disfigured, all were directed away from the prince's route. The royal chariot was prepared. Channa, the prince's devoted charioteer and companion, took the reins. The gates opened. Many traditional accounts record that on this day the gods, the Devas, intervened. They could not allow the perfect conditions of delusion to continue indefinitely. The time had come for the Bodhisattva, the being destined for awakening, to begin his journey. And so, by divine arrangement, what the king had hidden would at last be seen. The chariot moved through streets dressed in celebration. Faces smiled, flowers were thrown, music played. And then, a figure appeared at the roadside. He was bent, nearly double, his spine curved by the weight of decades. His hair, thin and white as winter grass, fell across a face mapped with 1,000 lines. His hands, swollen at the knuckles, gripped a staff with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. His steps were slow, uncertain, each one a small negotiation with gravity. Siddhartha stared. He had never seen this before. In all his 29 years, this reality had been kept from him as carefully as a state secret. "Śramaṇa," he said quietly. "What is that man?" And Śramaṇa, whether compelled by the gods or simply by his own inability to sustain the lie, answered truthfully, "My lord, that is an old man. His body has been worn by time. His strength has left him. His faculties have dimmed. This is old age, the fate that awaits all who are born." A long silence fell over the chariot. "All who are born?" the prince asked. "All who are born," Śramaṇa confirmed, "including you, my lord, including me." The procession returned to the palace, but the prince who crossed back through those gates was not the same man who had left them. Siddhartha sat alone. The musicians played. He did not hear them. The dancers moved. He did not see them. Food was brought. He did not eat. For the first time in his life, he had seen his own future written in another man's body. The smoothness of his own skin, the strength in his own limbs. These were not permanent possessions. They were loans. And the creditor would one day come to collect. This was not philosophical abstraction. This was visceral, personal, inescapable. Old age would come. The king, alarmed by his son's withdrawn demeanour, redoubled his efforts at distraction. More entertainers were summoned. More feasts were arranged. The walls were made higher, the gardens more beautiful. But the seed had been planted. On a second journey, again the accounts tell us through divine arrangement, Siddhartha encountered a second figure. This man lay at the side of the road, barely able to lift his head. His body was emaciated, the skin clinging to his bones like wet cloth. His breath came in laboured gasps. His eyes, clouded with pain and fever, stared at nothing. Flies moved around him and no one stopped to help. "Śramaṇa, what has happened to this man?" "He is sick, my lord. Disease has taken hold of his body. This is illness. It comes without invitation, without regard for wealth or station. Anybody at any time may be seized by it." "Anybody?" "Anybody, my lord." The chariot turned back toward the palace. Siddhartha returned again to his palace of pleasures, and again the pleasures failed him entirely. He understood now that beneath every laughing face lay a body capable of profound suffering. Behind every healthy smile was a nervous system waiting to transmit pain. The palace of perfect bodies and perfect smiles had become, in his newly awakened perception, a palace of creatures all secretly vulnerable, including himself. The Pali texts record that at this stage, Siddhartha began to truly contemplate the nature of the physical form. He was encountering for the first time what Buddhist philosophy would later call the anicca, impermanence of the body. This was not pessimism. This was accuracy. The third encounter was the most profound and the most terrifying. A funeral procession moved through the streets. A body, wrapped in white cloth, was carried upon a wooden bier by weeping relatives. Behind them walked mourners, faces streaked with grief, some beating their chests, some calling out the name of the departed. The air smelled of sandalwood and incense. Siddhartha watched in stunned silence. "Śramaṇa, what is this?" "My lord, that is a dead man. His life has ended. He will never speak again, never move again, never recognize the faces of those who loved him. This is death, the final destination of every living being that has ever drawn breath." "Every living being?" "Without exception, my lord." The chariot returned to the palace for the third time, but now the silence that surrounded Siddhartha was different. It was not the silence of sadness. nor of shock alone. It was the silence of a man whose entire framework of reality had been dismantled and lay in pieces at his feet. He had seen old age. He had seen sickness. He had seen death. 3 truths that every human being quietly knows and spends the majority of their waking hours carefully not thinking about. Why, he wondered, did people continue to celebrate, to compete, to accumulate wealth and status and power, when all of it ended in this? In a white-wrapped body on a wooden board carried by weeping strangers through a street of strangers, what was the point of any of it? The question that had whispered in the corners of his mind for years was now a roar. It was on a 4th journey, or in some accounts on the same day as the other encounters, that Siddhartha saw the figure that would change everything. Walking calmly through the very same streets that had shown him age, sickness, and death, there moved a man unlike any Siddhartha had encountered before. He was simple. He carried nothing but a begging bowl. His head was shaved. His robe was the color of saffron and ochre. His feet were bare upon the dusty road, but it was his face that arrested Siddhartha's attention. It was calm. Not the forced calm of a man suppressing emotion, but the deep, natural serenity of a still lake on a windless morning. His eyes held neither fear nor desire. He walked as though each step were exactly sufficient, as though the world in all its chaos and suffering were somehow workable. Who is that man, Channa? He is a Śramaṇa, my lord, a wandering ascetic. He has renounced the householder's life to seek liberation from suffering. He has no home, no possessions, no family. He wanders in pursuit of the truth. Siddhartha could not take his eyes from the monk. Here, amid the spectacle of decay and grief that the world had just revealed to him, was a single human being who appeared genuinely, impossibly, at peace. Not because he had escaped suffering, not because he was wealthy or powerful or beautiful, not because he had built walls high enough to keep death outside, but because he had apparently found something else, something the walls could not provide and the pleasures could not manufacture. The prince's heart stirred with a recognition that had no words. This was the 4th sight. And of the 4, it was the most important, because it pointed not toward the problem, but toward the possibility of a solution. As the chariot returned to the palace that day, something fundamental had shifted in Siddhartha's inner landscape. The first 3 sights had broken something open. They had exposed the fragility and impermanence that lay beneath the golden surfaces of his world. They had answered his unease with a clarity he had not sought and could not now unsee. The 4th sight had planted something, a question, now with a possible direction, a wound, now with a possible medicine. If that wandering monk had found equanimity in the face of old age, sickness, and death, if peace was genuinely attainable even within the conditions of mortal existence, then the path that led there was worth more than every palace, every feast, every jewel in the kingdom. The decision had not yet been made consciously, but in the deep current of his being, the course had already been set. The narrative of the 4 sights appears across multiple early Buddhist texts, each adding distinctive nuances to the account. The Nidānakathā, a Pali commentary attributed to Buddhacarita in the 5th century CE, provides the most narrative elaboration. The Lalitavistara Sūtra, a Mahayana text of the 2nd or 3rd century CE, introduces the motif of the Devas, divine beings who manipulate the encounters to ensure the Bodhisattva's awakening. The Buddhacarita of the poet Ashvaghosha, composed in the 1st or 2nd century CE and considered one of the earliest literary biographies of the Buddha, renders the encounters with remarkable psychological depth. The historicity of the 4 encounters as literal events is debated among scholars. What is not debated is their theological and philosophical centrality to the entire Buddhist project. They function within the tradition as the experiential foundation for the 4 noble truths, the very first teaching the Buddha would give after his enlightenment. The structural relationship between the 4 sights and the 4 noble truths is not accidental. It is rather the biographical narrative encoding the philosophical framework: old age, sickness, and death. The first three sites correspond to the first noble truth: dukkha, the pervasive unsatisfactoriness and suffering inherent in conditioned existence. The wandering monk, the fourth site, corresponds to the third noble truth: nirodha, the cessation of suffering, and to the fourth, magga, the path that leads to that cessation. What is notably absent from the four sites is the second noble truth: samudaya, the origin of suffering in craving and attachment. That understanding would come only through years of practice and, ultimately, through the night of enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree. The four sites, therefore, are not merely biography. They are philosophy rendered as human experience. The appearance of the devas in many versions of this story raises important questions of interpretation. In the Theravada tradition, the gods who transform themselves into the aged man, the sick man, the corpse, and the wandering monk are understood as cosmic agents of the Dharma, ensuring that the conditions for the Bodhisattva's awakening are met at the appropriate moment. In more rationalist readings, this divine intervention is understood symbolically. The encounters were not orchestrated by supernatural beings, but by the inevitable permeability of even the most carefully constructed delusion. Reality in all its rawness cannot be kept out indefinitely. The devas are, in this reading, the name given to the force of truth itself, which always eventually finds a way through. Both readings converge on the same conclusion: the awakening of consciousness was not accidental. It was, in some sense, always coming. To understand the significance of the fourth site, the wandering monk, it is necessary to appreciate the cultural and historical context of northern India in the 5th century BCE. The Śramaṇa movement was a broad countercultural phenomenon that emerged in tension with the established Brahmanical religious order. Where Brahmanism emphasized ritual purity, caste hierarchy, and Vedic sacrifice performed by hereditary priests, the Śramaṇas represented something radically different: individual seekers who had stepped outside the social order entirely in pursuit of direct, personal liberation. Jainism and Buddhism would both emerge from this Śramaṇa milieu. The site of a wandering renunciant would have been, for any educated person of Siddhartha's time, the site of a living question mark, a man who had rejected the answers society provided and gone in search of his own. For Siddhartha, it was the site of a possible answer. The texts record what happened in the palace that night with a detail that feels unmistakably psychological in its precision. Siddhartha returned to his chambers. Around him, the musicians and dancers who had been brought for his entertainment had fallen asleep, scattered across the floors and furnishings in ungainly positions, mouths open, hair dishevelled, limbs sprawled without grace. And Siddhartha looked at them, these carefully selected exemplars of youth and beauty, and saw, as if for the first time, what they actually were: mortal bodies, temporary arrangements of flesh and bone, destined for old age, sickness, and death. The beauty that the palace had constructed so carefully was, he now saw, a surface. Beneath it lay the same vulnerability he had seen in the old man by the road, in the sick man lying in the dust, in the white-wrapped form on the funeral bier. The palace had not protected him from the truth. It had merely delayed the encounter. Among the most humanly complex elements of this night is the figure of Yasodhara. The texts treat her with varying degrees of acknowledgement, but several accounts suggest that she was not unaware of the change that had come over her husband. She had been his companion, his intellectual equal, the mother of his child. She had loved him with a depth the palace walls could not contain. And she knew, in the way that those who truly love another person sometimes know, that something was leaving. The Theravada tradition records that on this night, Yasodhara dreamed troubling dreams. The Mahayana traditions, more elaborate in their treatment of her inner life, suggest that she understood what was coming and chose, in her love, not to stand in its way. Her story is one of the great untold narratives within the Buddhist biographical tradition, the grief of those who remain when a seeker departs. Before he left, Siddhartha went to the doorway of the room where Yasodhara lay sleeping, the infant Rahula cradled in her arms. He stood there for a long moment. He wanted to hold his son one final time. He wanted to press his lips to the child's forehead, to breathe in the particular warmth of a sleeping infant, to say the words that fathers say to sons in the middle of the night. But he did not enter the room. He was afraid. The texts tell us that if he held his son, he would not be able to leave, that the weight of that small body in his arms would anchor him to a world he now understood could not give him what he sought. And so he looked, and he turned away. This moment, the father standing in the doorway, the sleeping child, the door not crossed, is perhaps the most quietly devastating passage in the entire biographical tradition. It is the cost of the path, rendered in human terms. Siddhartha descended to the royal stables in the deep silence of the night. He called for Channa. He asked for his horse, Kanthaka, a white stallion described in the texts as magnificent, swift, and entirely devoted to his master. Channa, who had driven the chariot on each of the 4 fateful journeys, who had answered each terrible question with honest words, did not ask why. He prepared the horse. In the Buddhacarita, Ashvaghosha writes of Kanthaka's hooves being muffled by the gods so that the palace would not wake. The gates opened of their own accord. The sleeping city lay still. Siddhartha mounted his horse. He took one last look at the palace, at the walls that had been built to protect him, and had instead made inevitable this departure. Then he rode forward into the dark, toward the forest. The great renunciation had begun. What the 4 sites represent at their deepest level is an epistemological event, a radical restructuring of how a consciousness apprehends reality. Before the sights, Siddhartha experienced the world through the filter of comfort, beauty, and permanence, the carefully constructed delusion that Suddhodana had built and maintained at great effort. This is what the Buddhist tradition calls avidya, ignorance, or more precisely, the failure to see things as they actually are. The 4 sights did not create suffering, they revealed it. They peeled back the socially constructed layer of reassuring appearances and exposed the bedrock of impermanence that lies beneath all conditioned existence. This, the tradition teaches, is what genuine spiritual inquiry requires, not the manufacture of new experiences, but the clear-eyed examination of the experiences we are already having and have been carefully trained not to fully see. One of the most enduring insights embedded in this narrative is its universality. Every human being at some point has their own 4 sights. The moment you sat beside someone you loved as they aged beyond the person you knew them as. The day a diagnosis was delivered in a quiet doctor's office. The first funeral you attended where the reality of it truly reached you. Not as an abstract concept, but as a fact about your own life. The Buddhist tradition doesn't ask us to manufacture suffering. It asks us to stop averting our gaze from the suffering that is already there, to let the reality of impermanence do what it does when we do not immediately distract ourselves from it, and then, crucially, to look for the 4th sight, to ask whether, within these conditions, a different relationship to existence is possible, whether peace is available not in spite of impermanence, but somehow, mysteriously, within it. Tonight, in the deep silence of the Indian night, a prince rode away from everything the world had given him. He had looked at old age, sickness, and death, not as unfortunate exceptions to an otherwise pleasant reality, but as the very texture of conditioned existence. He had seen, in a wandering monk's serene face, the suggestion that liberation was possible. He was 29 years old. Ahead of him lay years of searching, wandering the forests, sitting with teachers, pushing his body to the edge of survival in practices of extreme asceticism. He had not yet found the answer, but he had at last found the right question. In episode 3, we will follow Siddhartha into the forest as he undertakes the great renunciation, the night he gave up everything, and began the journey that would lead, 6 years later, to the most important moment in the history of human consciousness. Thank you for watching The Life of the Buddha. If this episode has been meaningful to you, please share it with someone who is also asking the right questions. Until next time, may all beings be free from suffering.